Beware of the blob, it leaps and creeps and slides and glides across the floor, right through the door and all around the walls. A blotch, a splotch, be careful of the blob. Okay, so as you might have guessed, I've seen the blob recently. Actually, I saw the 1988 remake of the blob recently, about a week ago. I've seen the original 1958, much better. So I got to thinking about how exactly would the blob work in real life if it was real. Um, so we're going to look at the science of the blob. Now, part of preparation for this, I went and watched Beware the Blob, the 1972 remake of the original movie. It was really a weird movie, really bad. It was largely a repeat of the same plot. They started it differently. It's the same blob. Into the first one, they send it up to Antarctica to be frozen. This one starts, a guy was working on the pipeline, and his bulldozer chipped off a piece of permafrost which had the blob in it. And he brought it back for analysis, and it thaws out, and bad things happen. But then the rest of the movie is very similar to the first one and how it runs. No one believes there's a monster until the very end, when it's like suddenly the whole town is forced to believe there's a monster, and etc. Um, One thing about the 1972 sequel, it's what I would call an ennui film. I've mentioned this before in past videos. Basically, you don't form an emotional attachment to any of the characters, and so you really don't mind when they die. In fact, you're actually looking forward to some of the characters dying just because they're so annoying. First one wasn't like that. The sequel in '72 was, and then of course the remake in 1988 of the original was also very much ennui. There are some characters you were hoping would make it and they didn't, but for the most part, yeah, it's like it was hard to form an emotional attachment to some of these characters. The second one, the '88 version, which I'm just going to call the new version, and as opposed to the original from now on. That had some bad stuff happening in the form of they rewrote some stuff. First one, the blob is just an alien from space, or it came from space. It's some sort of alien creature. The second one, it came from space, but it was part of a satellite. We were doing virus research and sent it up. So instead of just having this, creature going about attacking people, you have a government plot. They also did some other stuff different with it, which I will go into when we start to go into the quote-unquote science of the blob. So primarily, first one, the original, and the sequel to it, Beware the Blob, they both mention that it's basically a single-celled organism, supposedly. Um, that said, I will get into that some. And, most articles or other information you read about it will mention it being a single-celled organism. Now, it does do things like it goes through a grate, and which means it sort of have to split up and then recombine, which cells don't do that generally. So that would make it seem multicellular. Both movies, it's actually the remake, or not, the '88 remake doesn't really do it that much. The original and the sequel, yes, it goes through vents and stuff, and so it has to break up and recombine. The remake doesn't do that as much, although I think it does do it some. So that's the one thing the remake has above the sequels, or the original, I should say. So is it a single-celled? And so that's the first question I would have. And apparently not. I do have a theory where it could be, which I will get into later when we get to that part. So what is it? Also, in the remake, they tried to make it more intelligent, or it seemed like it was more intelligent. The original is basically just a hungry thing which goes around eating everything it runs into. The remake, they sort of gave it a little more intelligence, or it seemed like they were trying to. So that's one thing the remake does not have going for it. So, and that's I guess the first thing is basically the original. What I liked about the original is it was just an eating machine. It wasn't a killing machine. It was an eating machine. It was trying to survive, going around just engulfing anyone who it encountered. So it's not like we can talk about the good or evil of the blob, or psychoanalyze the blob like everyone wants to do monsters these days. It was just it's out for food, and it's not really evil. It's just hungry. So what does it eat? It eats people, and the first one it never ate an animal, not obviously at least. The sequel to it, it did, and then the remake, I don't think it did. Now it doesn't just eat people; it eats clothes. It eats everything: bone, clothes. There was no trace left behind in the original. In the remake, they sort of would have, okay, you can see bones floating around inside, which aren't quite fully digested yet, or stuff like that. Which again, it's a different creature from the original in that sense. Um, it doesn't eat plants. That's one thing amazing about it is it goes around. The original took place in a small town, rural surroundings, and it's going around looking for things to eat, and it's just ignoring all the plant life. So it only eats living thing. Well, only eats animals or humans. Apparently. Um, and like I said, it will eat clothing and other personal effects, apparently. But at the same time, it doesn't just engulf like cars. The sequel to it, there were people in cars, and it went up on the car but didn't break in. It had to try to find a way into the car to get to them. So, yeah, it's eating habits are hard to explain. Now, one thing I got to think, it's an alien, so is it carbon based? You eat foods which are based on what you are. Yeah, we eat carbon based foods because we need carbon to survive. The blob, it's a large gelatinous type mass. It's very liquid in nature, although not pure liquid. So is it carbon based, or is it more, could we say, water based? And so therefore, yes, it's still going to eat people. It would start going after plants, then I would assume, because they're also got a high water content. But I mean, that would be one explanation of how it's not a carbon-based life form, but it still takes in all the carbon and other minerals in the person and their clothing, etc. That's another thing. It eats clothing. It doesn't eat plants. I don't see where that one comes from. But so one theory I could put is yes, it is carbon based. I could put in that it needs the other minerals. It's more water based, but it does need those other minerals and stuff for function. Because while it is very oozy and liquid like, gelatin like, it still has a little bit of solid, yeah, solidity holding it together. And then I would also throw out the theory, what if it's somehow converting stuff? Like, yeah, we break down minerals and stuff, or various molecules we break down and build from those. What if it's actually breaking down actual atoms? So it's taking in all the elements, but it's converting them to whatever it's based, liquid based, potassium based, whatever, so it's not carbon based, but it can convert stuff to whatever element it is based on. My thought on that is that would take a lot more energy. Um, Basically, I eat food, I get energy from the food I eat. Some of that energy goes to breaking down and processing my next meal. So what I eat last meal goes to helping me digest my future meal. And so I have to get more energy from the food than it takes to process the food. Otherwise, I can't do anything else. Now, supposing the blob is actually converting stuff from one element to another element, that probably takes a lot more energy. And so it has to eat a lot more. It's not just going around eating for the sake of eating. It's every time it eats, it actually gets hungrier. That would be an interesting way to look at it. I don't know if the writers intended it to be that way, but so it's never going to stop eating. That is one thing they all hinted at in the thing is eventually it would just like destroy the nation or the world or whatever because it would just keep on eating. So that would be an explanation of why it does what it does and why it's just an eating machine. So how does it hunt? So again, it ignores plants, we know. It is able to find people. The original, it didn't appear to be overly intelligent. The remake, it was a little more intelligent. Not the remake, but the sequel. And then the remake was a lot more intelligent, it seemed, although it wasn't in the sense of doing math problems and stuff. And so I would say possibly it seeks out body heat, and that's one of the reasons it ignores plants. Sound and or vibrations or whatever, so it can detect people. So it's not really hunting in the same sense where we would. It is going off of stimulus. And yet, hunting by heat would be a little more difficult because heat, there are other sources of heat as well as how well does heat travel over a distance. But other than that, that could work. Vibrations and sounds would work, like I said. We do know that it doesn't like the cold, so again, hunting by body heat would make a little sense. Actually, the cold is the only way to stop it, is to freeze it, so you aren't really killing it. So that's apparently how it hunts. Basically, now the interesting thing about both the remake and the original did this was its first victim. So basically, it comes down. It's about fist sized, maybe, and its first victim. It takes a while to consume. So this is the remake. They pretty much stole this from the original. Some guy gets it on his hand, and they take him to the hospital, and they check later, and it's like spread over his body. So it takes a while, and the guy's in pain. Obviously, that's one thing. As it gets bigger, it can absorb things faster, and so it's probably still not a pleasant way to die, but the pain lasts less. So this guy, the original victim, as it's consuming him and growing off of him, he's slowly being absorbed and digested by it. And it takes 12 hours, maybe, I think. You know, it doesn't really give us a time frame, but it does take a few hours at least to get him. At this point, it is absorbed in, so it is about man sized, maybe a little smaller, depending on how the process works. So its next one or two victims, in the original at least, it took a little while longer to absorb them. But still, it went faster than it did the first guy because it was big enough to do it. The remake, I don't think they really. The remake, they sort of had it just become very big after its first victim. And so it still took a few, maybe a minute, 30 seconds to absorb the next victim. And it did look painful. But it seemed to go faster than in the original. And then from then on, it was fairly quick process. More people it eats, the bigger it gets. And we got this cycle of continuous eating machine, which, like I said, if it is like us where it doesn't need to eat a full meal to digest the next one, shouldn't be. So I'm thinking there might be something going on internally where it's just got a hypermetabolism. It's converting elements to other elements in order to use them more properly, and that's taking more energy. So, like I said, it's just this giant eating cycle. Would make sense. So the sequel, the 72 version, they had the blob, but then they would have like every now and then like a tendril would go out, and so like they would the first victim was actually a cat. Actually, the first victim was a fly, then it got the cat later. And the cat's having none of this thing, but it sits out the little tendril and manages to snatch its ball, and then drags it in. So it's fairly strong. It can a cat-sized blob can pull a cat. So that's one thing going on. And that goes back to the original old guy in the first movie. He can't get this thing off him, and so it doesn't just stick to you. It like partly absorbs into you and then does whatever it does to digest you. So there is no escape once it touches you. It just attaches. Well, I guess you could try to freeze it off, but no one did in any of the movies. That would give away the ending too soon. So its eating process seems to be to partly merge with and then start absorbing the person. So it can't just be torn off all of a sudden. And again, it's painful, according to all the earlier victims. But, like I said, the sequel, the Beware the Blob, it started having just these little tendrils. It still looked like little globs of gelatin, just sort of extending themselves a little bit. The remake had these horrible. We're just gonna have where it can shoot out. I'm gonna call them tentacles. Basically, it looked like they took the CGI from an alien film with tentacles and just put it on the blob. So the little tentacles that shot out, they didn't wrap around like tentacles. Again, it was sort of a straight out snatch and pull in type thing. But the graphics still looked different than the blob itself. There was like a different type of tissue, different whatever, which just gave the look of it a really bad appearance. It wasn't as good as the original, where they had to do some work to get the blob to look like it was attacking people, and it looked like the blob was attacking someone as opposed to a sudden computer effect attacking them. Okay, so back to the origin stories here. First one was an alien, which is why I say it might not be a carbon-based life form. The remake, we sent a virus out into space and it mutated and came back. So how does this thing reproduce? They never talked about it. So basic mitosis, it eats enough, then it splits into two. That would be one explanation if it was going to. Thing about that is, why does it have to eat so much? Mitosis, cell, or single-celled organism, it grows to a little over twice its normal size and then splits, and then the two halves sort of heal into original thing, or into separate entities. Whereas this thing originally was about fist sized, and it grew to size of a trailer, I think, in the original. So why would it have to get that big if it's reproducing this way, or is it just never reproducing? That's a good question. Now the sequel, it was carbon based because it was a virus we sent out. Evil government sent out a virus into space, and it's the satellite it was on crashed back. So viruses will basically they can't reproduce on their own. They invade a cell and then they trick the cell into reproducing copies of the virus. The cell breaks apart and the copies of the virus spread around. So again, why would this thing have to grow as large as it did, which got to, I think, about the size of a tank in the second one, or in the remake, I should say, before it's absorbing humans, so it's got our DNA, it's got our cells to reproduce it, or to start reproducing it. So it's not really going to reproduce in the same manner. Now again, none of these movies did it try to reproduce. This is just speculation. If it did reproduce, how would it work? And like I said, mitosis would work for the original. It's again supposedly a single-celled organism. I sort of explained why that doesn't work as well. Actually, I was going to get back to that. And the second one, where it's a virus, it can't reproduce on its own, so why isn't it forcing the people it absorbs to reproduce smaller versions of itself? Which would make more sense for that. So like I said, it is able to go through grates and stuff, which is one of the reasons why it says, is it really a single-celled organism? And my answer to that would be, it could be if it's reabsorbing itself. It breaks apart and then it's basically cannibalizing itself and then reforming. That would work. Be a little grotesque maybe, but I guess if you're some sort of space amoeba, you got different versions of grotesque. And I think that is it. Reproduction I've done eating, I've done, is it carbon-based or not? I've done the whole tendril thing and how jank that was in the more recent release. But yeah, again, the Beware the Blob sequel sort of made it work because they used the same material to make their little tendrils, and they didn't have them shoot out super far. They went out maybe, a few inches, or so it didn't look as bad on that one. So that is it. The psychology of the blob, like I said, in all of them, they're just basically eating machines, although in the remake, they did sort of give it a little more intelligence. Other than that, basic hunting instincts. And so that's it. That is, with the information given, that's the best scientific explanation of the blob I could give. Have a nice day. Where's my cursor? out. Okay, computer doesn't want to turn off.